Struggle and the longing to be free. So we had a workshop this weekend, a congregational workshop with Reverend Meg Roberts, a colleague of ours, facilitating. A bunch of you were there. I'm impressed that you're here again this morning. We talked about a lot of things, but one of the threads of the workshop was culture. Talking about the culture of our congregation. Culture and Unitarian Universalism was on my mind. And it's also been a thread, I think many of you have probably noticed, in what we've been talking about this whole church year. It's been kind of touched on in a number of services. And I remember in one of the very first services, I asked you to call out qualities of the culture of this place, qualities of the culture of this congregation. And you called out a lot of things, and I was surprised, and I have to say really impressed, that one of the first things that someone called out was whiteness. Whiteness, which is not typically easy to talk about, right? It's not an easy part of our public conversation to talk about whiteness, talk about race. And I'm going to talk a little about it today, and I feel that unease in me, and I just want to share that with you as I start. I'm talking about it because there's a wider conversation happening in our movement right now. It's been located mostly in the Unitarian Universalist Association, of which we are duly affiliated with our Canadian Unitarian Council and the UUA. And it's a conversation that has involved a flurry of statements and letters and all around this topic of race and culture. And as you might imagine from your own experience of talking about things like that, it's been a little bit heated. Emotions have been running high, reactivity, anxiety. And the event that precipitated it, I'm just going to give you a little window so you know kind of what's going on in the bigger Unitarian Universalist world right now. The event that precipitated it was there was a hiring decision of another white man in a key senior leadership position in the organization over, the narrative was shared, over a Latina woman. And the events since then, there's been a lot of unclarity about exactly what happened, and that's really not what we're going to talk about. But suffice to say, the president of the association and 2 senior staff people have resigned. There's a lot of intense debate now about what to do, what do we need to do to change the cultures and practices of our institutions to align them with our values. And one of the things that was called upon was for congregations, this was called upon by leaders of color in our movement. People of color, as one of our colleagues says, the global majority, calling on our congregations to have a white supremacy teach-in. And we start with this language, and there's a number of, when we talk about race, there's a number of language issues that we have to tease apart a little bit. So I think for a lot of folks, when you hear white supremacy, you think of cross-burning and extremism, neo-Nazism, right? Nazism. And what these leaders of color mean by white supremacy, what many people of color, many white activists and whites in academic settings, when they talk about white supremacy, they're not talking so much about those things. They're talking about the logic, the way of thinking, the worldview that gives rise to those. And it gives rise to those, and it also happens in much more insidious and subtle ways, even in liberal institutions that propose and do in fact have very different values, right? So this racism, this white supremacy occurs in institutions that have values counter to it. That's the basic premise here, and the invitation was to have a teach-in, to have a time to actually talk about it, because it's not easy to talk about. And I'd say probably one of my biggest struggles has been coming as an American, as somebody from the States, here in Canada, trying to understand the culture that I've come from that has a very different dynamic around race, and be able to talk about it a little bit here. So I want you to know, over 500 of our congregations have been doing this over the last month. including 2 others in Metro Vancouver, as well as a handful of others across Canada. So we're in this conversation with our bigger body. And one of the quotes that I came across was from an academic, a white academic, Shauna Carroll. And she summarized a thought that I've heard from many people this year as I've just done a little exploration of, okay, what are the dynamics around race here? She said, in the very beginning of a paper titled The Construction and Perpetuation of Whiteness, she said, white privilege is a prevalent phenomenon in Canadian society. And one of the most discouraging aspects of this phenomenon is that white privilege and whiteness ideology are not discussed sufficiently. Which means that the mentality and the way society is functioning will continue to favor whiteness ideology. So we don't talk about it enough, and therefore it continues going on. That's the premise here. So I want to invite us to start with a question, and in a moment I'm actually going to ask you to talk about it a little. What are some of your earliest memories of learning about race? How did you first discover that race existed? I'm going to invite you to talk with a neighbor and say, thanks, Mary. You're right there with me. I know it. So I'm going to just let you know one of mine and then invite you to share. So one of mine, I remember in grade 2, I became aware for the first time. I had a teacher. I loved this teacher, but I got scared a couple of times by his anger. He got really angry with some of the misbehaving in class a couple of times. One time he threw a piece of chalk. Another time, and this became a bigger deal, he threw a chair. Not at anyone, he was just so frustrated. But his frustration was always, every day, it was because of the darkest-skinned boy in the class. And I remember that this grade 2, 7-year-old self thinking that there was a correlation here, noticing I was starting to make a story about race that had to do with who behaves well and who does not. So just want to take a moment now, if you will. Turn to your neighbor and just, if you have a story, it doesn't have to be your earliest, but any early memory you have of learning about race, discovering that race existed, positive, negative, neutral, anything that comes to mind when you think about early memories of learning about race. Go ahead, just take a moment with somebody nearby. Thanks for your willingness to do that. If any of you can capture an insight from that story, what you learned from it in a phrase or a sentence, what would you say? Just a couple of them if you've got them. What did you learn from that experience?
Discomfort.
Discomfort. From doing it just now or from the learning early on?
The experience.
The original experience, good. That's what I'm asking about, yeah. That's an original experience. You learned discomfort. Yeah.
I learned that although we were different and we still had value, but that different cultures have different things that they expect of their children but that my parents said we were still all of the same value.
So cultures have differences, there are real differences, and they all have value. And we taught that explicitly, yeah. Separateness. There's an us and them. There's a difference that can create some distance.
And shock.
Shock.
So that was an experience where I realized someone who'd grown up just like me had a very different experience in life because of the way she looked.
So it had a very similar context that they grew up in, but because of their skin color, because of the way they looked, they had a very different experience. Yeah, and shock to become aware of that.
In the Netherlands, I lived in Amsterdam. I'm talking about, mid-30s, 40s, when I was young. It was much more about different religions, and color was really wasn't visible, but status, financial status was very much important. How you spoke, and what you would say, and what you would do. That was much more of a problem for us kids.
Right.
So where the color was not a problem.
So looking at the Netherlands, 1930s, color was not there. was all shared, right? But other things still played that role. Yeah, so that these dynamics can be applied across other differences as well. Yeah.
I grew up in East Vancouver, so I was a minority in high school. And so it wasn't until I got older that I realized, oh, that's not normal. Like,
Right.
the separation for me was like, it was normal to be around all different people, all different races. And there was obviously some racism or judgment, but it was more normal than
Yeah. So growing up white in East Van and having it be normal to have a big mix, and then realizing that that was not the normal, the majority experience.
That the government assumed or believed that Native and First Nations people, not called that then, were second or third class citizens not allowed to go in a liquor store. And I had to get that explanation from my father because I was 6.
So at 6, learning that there were legal class differentiation between
Yes.
white Canadians and First Nations Canadians.
Yes.
Yeah.
My dad worked for the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and he brought people from all around the world over to dinner all the time. And I would have a lot of feeling that my parents thought that this was wonderful to welcome people from around the world. And absolutely, it was a sort of a source of us learning about the world. And we were definitely great about that.
There's this value on learning from all around the world. Okay, one last one.
Undistinguished fear. You know, me and my partner, we were crossing the border. We were going to New York, and a cop stopped us in the middle of the night, and we literally got afraid. You know, two black women, where are you going? It was scary. And at that moment, I thought, okay, not I'm Canadian, because we showed her, and we were shaking, you know. And it was the first time I distinguished fear with authority because of my mother.
Being pulled over by cops near the border.
For no reason, we were driving, and everything was legit, and you know, and we were wondering why we spoke French and we were black. And
Right.
working.
And the learning that I should be afraid, I need to be afraid of authority because of the color of my skin. Yeah. Okay, last one, Ian, go ahead.
Bear with me if it's been mentioned before because I don't hear too well. A very brief story. Bought my second house in West Van, 1965, and in all the fine print promised that I would not sell to Asian people.
Right. 1965, we talked about this a couple of months ago, but these are still on the books. They're not legal anymore, but they're still on the books for properties across right here, where we are in the British properties. That you cannot sell your property to anyone of Asian descent. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So here we are. Here we are. It's not that long ago. These worse atrocities. It's in living memory. And there are contemporary atrocities that happen still today, right? I had a classmate in seminary. She talked about a dream she had once. It was a dream, and she was holding a baby and asking everyone, she'd go around to each person asking, whose baby is this? And somehow she knew the baby belonged to each person that she asked, but they all denied it. They all denied recognizing this baby. As she explained, the baby for her was racism. A somewhat jarring image, but profound to consider, this great societal evil in the image of an unwanted baby. No one willing to claim it as their own. In a world where it seems like we almost every month wait anxiously for whether another country will embrace nationalistic, xenophobic leaders. All the time, this great swelling. It's easy to point to the racism in others. That baby belongs to the South. That's what we say when I come from. Let them deal with it. Or to the French who voted for Le Pen, or to the British clamoring to leave the EU, or to the farmers in the plains who lack respect for their indigenous neighbors. Strident, overt racism seems to be gaining ground these days. Certainly has a louder public presence than it has in a little while. And in the face of this wave, those whose values run counter, which I believe is all of us in this room, we can feel helpless. What can we do here, liberal Vancouver, to combat the nationalism and xenophobia, the racism run rampant in the world? Some instructive words from Lao Tse, the Chinese philosopher who taught several hundred years before Jesus of Nazareth. He's quoted this way: "If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. And if there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart." Most of us may not have the opportunities to confront those promoting explicit and extreme white supremacy out there in the world. But all of us, and I would say especially us white folks, we can confront the ways in which it lives in our own hearts, in the institutions that we live our daily lives in. So the explicit curriculum, what was taught intentionally about race that I learned growing up, was basically that racism was a horror of history, but that it was in the past. Becoming aware that racism still exists and that I participate in it, that it's my baby, that was a gradual process for me. So a couple of times that I learned more about it. I was in university, and I was taking a class titled Black Feminism, really wonderful class, and I was working on getting a presentation organized, and we were talking about who might say something about something, that doesn't really matter. But another white student and I, we thought that this one African-American black student in the class would be great to talk about that, and we said to our advisor and teacher, because she's so articulate. And on its face, if you don't know any of the context about race, that is a fine reason to ask somebody to talk about something. But what they shared with us that day is that calling a person of color articulate is something that white folks do that they don't do about other white folks. Now, that's not 100% of the time, but it's one of those coded words, because the assumption is that she wouldn't be. Another story, a little more profound. I was working as a chaplain in a hospital, working on mental health unit, really engaging and intense work. And I had a conversation that was odd for me the whole time. This was with a woman on the adult mental health unit, and I couldn't quite tell why it was odd until I went to chart the conversation, right, to write the notes up in the electronic chart, and I realized that the person who I was talking to was not the person I thought I had been talking to, because I had gotten their faces mixed up in my mind. I had assumed this one black woman was another black woman who I had had a conversation with the week before. My role as spiritual provider, as chaplain, was completely useless to that woman. In fact, more than useless, it was harmful. And we do this. We mistake people. The science of it says it's lack of exposure. Basically, we don't learn well enough if we are not exposed early on how to distinguish the traits of people of a different race than our own. A colleague of mine in that same group, another chaplain, described a very similar experience confusing two white women. And so, what do we do with these experiences? In the conversation about anti-racism, the fight against racism, they're known as microaggressions. They might pale in comparison to other atrocities that have been committed by the logic of white supremacy, but they serve as a near constant reminder to those impacted by them that the dominant culture is built on a logic that holds them inferior. Right? Microaggressions, daily experiences of being told you're less than, or not even told, implied. Handel Wright, who's on the education faculty at the Center for Culture, Identity, and Exploration at UBC, he spoke at an event in March that was titled Examining Whiteness, What's at Stake for Canada? And he compared what he called the image text of Canada, the image text, the story that's told of a beautiful mosaic of diversity, the welcoming and tolerant nation that embraces pluralism and the other, against the historical and present realities of white supremacies, from residential schools that have been so present lately in the public eye, to racist immigration laws and policies throughout the 20th century, to recent, shocking examples of explicit white supremacist pamphlets distributed in Richmond, right here, the shooting at the Quebec Mosque, as well as what he termed the soft white supremacy of the whiteness of Canadian institutions in culture and leadership. But it was one of his conclusions about the path forward that I most wanted to lift up with you. He said, white fragility is a luxury no one can afford. White fragility. The disposition towards ignorance, denial, guilt, and defensiveness when it comes to the subject of race. I know that I've felt all of those many times and acted from them. I remember once at a training about racism and white privilege, another white person once told me that he was really struggling with this whole way of thinking about and acknowledging our complicity in racism. That just by existing in this society that we have white privilege, and his problem with it was that it sounded too much like original sin. I thought, what a great insight, right? This feeling of there's something wrong with me because of it. And I think that that's the source of at least some of that white fragility. We don't want to be bad. Nobody here invented racism. No one here is responsible for anything close to the worst atrocities committed because of it. And yet, it's our baby too. And I've said this before, there's no room in this faith for original sin. There's nothing inherently wrong with anyone. We're not born sinful. But we are born into what I call original struggle. Humans have been struggling with these issues, with difference and power and community and inclusion and culture and values for millennia. You did not create racism. You are not responsible for its existence, but you were born into this struggle and you are responsible for how you deal with it in this life. And for those of us who are white, we cannot afford to waste time feeling guilty or defensive. And again, it's just for the world, it's just as much for the world, for that beautiful image text, that vision of multiculturalism, just as much for our own souls. Because what seems like a blessing may be white privilege. And what seems like white privilege may be a curse. The blessing of white privilege has been thoroughly documented, do provide material advantage, increase access to safety and comfort, but at what cost? The cost borne by the global majority in stunning atrocities and daily microaggressions, is also reflected in the cost to white integrity and wholeness. What seems like a blessing may be a curse. James Baldwin, one of the great essayists of the 20th century, named this curse the price of the ticket. Near the end of the essay by that name, he instructs this: go back to where you started. As far back as you can, examine all of it, travel your road again and tell the truth about it, sing or shout or testify or keep it to yourself, but know whence you came. Baldwin's contention is that the construction of whiteness relies on a cultural amnesia, a forgetting of traditional practices and erasure of culture. Wave after wave of immigrant, especially down south, but here too, had to become white. And while the mosaic image is certainly a superior metaphor to the melting pot, does it not happen here too? Later in the midnight hour, the missing identity aches, Baldwin writes. The price the white American paid for his ticket was to become white. This incredibly limited, not to say dim-witted ambition has choked many a human being to death here. The image text is a beautiful vision. You've probably had moments like that one Emily described last week from the playgroup. Those moments where you catch a glimpse of the world as it can and should be, the world as we hope it is becoming. And I think that we too, in this congregation, in this faith tradition, we can become that people. But to do so will require us, more than looking outward at injustice in the world, at perpetrators of heinous and overt racism, more it will require us to look inward, to do the soul work of wrestling with this struggle we have inherited. You've likely heard these words from an Aboriginal activist group in Queensland, Australia. Words directed toward the well-meaning, helpful white folk who might show up from time to time with offers of aid and assistance. They said, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. The struggle for racial justice is all of our struggle. The fate of the world and the fate of our own hearts depends on it. Amen. And blessed be.